Summer, 1944. The air over northern France is thick and still, a silence so unnatural it seems to press against the earth itself. German sentries along the coast shift uneasily in their watchtowers. Their radios crackle, then fall dead. One outpost calls to another, only to meet static. Within minutes, a chain of voices goes silent, one after the other, like lights being snuffed out in a long, dark corridor. In Berlin, phones ring deep into the night. Generals lean over trembling maps, their fingers tracing coastlines, now ghosted in confusion. Radar screens, once alive with pulsing signals of Allied aircraft, suddenly show nothing. Entire sectors of their defense network vanish without warning. It's as if the English Channel itself has swallowed their eyes and ears whole. Outside, the wind shifts. From Calais to Cherbourg, German operators stare into the dark sea, waiting for the faint hum of engines or the distant echo of artillery. But there is nothing. No planes, no ships, no movement at all, and yet something is moving, quietly, invisibly, beneath the cover of night. American intelligence officers and engineers are already deep inside occupied territory, weaving an operation so secret that even their own commanders won't know its full extent. No gunfire, no invasion fleet, just silence, the kind of silence that comes before history changes forever. This wasn't the D-Day the world remembers. This was the one no one ever saw, the silent invasion that began long before the first soldier set foot on Normandy's sands. The night silence over. Northern France had set the stage for something the world would scarcely believe, a battle fought not with bullets, but with shadows. Thousands of miles away from the front lines, in a bustling office in New York City, a plan was taking shape that would redefine warfare itself. It wasn't generals in uniform, nor hardened infantry who would lead this charge. It was artists, designers, sound engineers, college graduates whose greatest experience with war had been in classrooms, studios and concert halls, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, known to almost no one at the time, became the home of America's most unusual soldiers, the Ghost Army. Their mission was as simple as it was audacious: convince the Germans that a massive invasion force loomed on the horizon, while the real attack would strike elsewhere. What they lacked in weaponry, they made up for with imagination. Canvas tanks, rubber trucks, and speakers became their arsenal. Fake radio chatter crackled across the airwaves, recording the sounds of artillery and marching soldiers. Inflatable Sherman tanks, towering and grotesque in their mimicry, rolled across fields, casting enormous shadows that terrified enemy observers. For these young men, the stakes were unimaginable. They weren't trained for battle. They were trained to lie convincingly. A misplaced sound effect, a poorly designed dummy vehicle, or a radio transmission that failed to convince could cost thousands of lives. Yet every night, in abandoned barns, empty airfields, and camouflaged fields, they practiced. One false sound here, a misplaced shadow there. Everything was scrutinized, perfected, and rehearsed like a theater production, with the highest of stakes. Among them were painters who had spent their lives mixing colors on canvases, now painting patterns on tents to mimic armored divisions. Sculptors turned their hands to crafting rubber guns, their works designed to deceive through perspective. Musicians recorded the thunder of artillery, the steady march of boots, and even the panicked shouts of imagined soldiers. Each sound was layered, distorted, and amplified to travel miles across the countryside. They traveled in convoys of the absurd, trucks carrying inflatable tanks, wooden jeeps, and canvas airplanes. From the sky, it was chaos. From the ground, the Germans saw what looked like a full-scale mobilization. In many instances, German reconnaissance planes would fly overhead, report back, and be none the wiser. Commanders, interpreting what they saw through a filter of fear and expectation, began diverting troops, fortifying sectors that didn't exist. The human cost of this silent war was not in bloodshed, but in tension. Young men, barely old enough to vote, faced the constant threat of discovery. A single patrol finding one of their dummy tanks could expose the operation. Yet these men moved with uncanny precision, guided by nothing more than ingenuity and nerves of steel. Letters sent home were vague, filled with vague tales of military exercises and training maneuvers. Families could not know the truth, that their sons, brothers and husbands were shaping the very battlefield through illusion. It was in this environment that courage took on a new definition. Fear was constant, but so was determination. They would walk miles under cover of darkness, setting up decoy encampments, ensuring every shadow fell exactly as it should. A misplaced shadow could spell disaster, yet they moved with a painter's eye for detail and a composer's sense of timing. And it worked. Reports began filtering back to the German high command of troop concentrations in areas where no soldiers actually existed. Divisions were held in place, artillery units redeployed, and reserves kept far from Normandy. The Ghost Army's illusions became a force multiplier, their creativity turning the tide before a single Allied soldier landed on the beaches. In a world consumed by tanks, guns, and bullets, it was a whisper of imagination that made the difference. These young men, armed only with deception, had created an invisible army that Germany could neither confront nor comprehend. As the Allies prepared for the storm of D-Day, the Ghost Army moved silently through fields and forests, leaving no trace of their passing except for the shadows they cast and the lies they wove. By the time the real invasion began, entire divisions of the German army were misled, stationed miles away from where they were most needed. And yet for the men of the Ghost Army, there was no glory, no medals, and no public recognition. Their battles were fought in silence, their victories unseen. Their bravery measured not by enemy casualties, but by the lives spared by their ruse. It was the kind of courage that history almost forgot, but that would forever remain at the heart of America's silent invasion. In a war defined by destruction, the most powerful weapon turned out to be imagination itself. And as the night fell over the occupied French coast once more, the Ghost Army prepared for their next act, unaware that every shadow they cast was pulling Germany further into a web of deception from which it could not escape. The war was no longer just fought on beaches or in the skies. It was waged in whispers, in shadows, in carefully crafted lies. While the Ghost Army maneuvered through fields and forests, the Allies were orchestrating a far more ambitious deception, one that would stretch across nations and confound the most experienced German commanders. This was Operation Bodyguard, a sprawling, multi-layered plan designed to blind Hitler and his generals, to convince them that the true invasion was anywhere but Normandy. At the heart of Bodyguard were the spies and agents who risked their lives daily in enemy territory. Among the most brilliant was Juan Pujol Garcia, a Spaniard known to the Germans as Garbo. With his intricate network of false reports, imaginary subagents, and perfectly timed radio messages, he convinced the German High Command that Allied forces were massing across the Channel in Scotland, Norway, and the Pas-de-Calais. Every transmission was calculated to reinforce the illusion of strength where none existed. Every misdirection, every lie carried the weight of human life. Across Europe, other double agents played their roles with equal precision. Couriers delivered forged orders, false documents were deliberately discovered, and entire radio networks were set up to broadcast the hum of preparation, the murmur of logistics, the false chatter of officers planning maneuvers that were never meant to exist. The Germans consumed this information greedily, interpreting each signal through the lens of fear and expectation, unaware that they were feeding the Allies' deception, the Ghost Army's decoys. Inflatable tanks and fake camps were only one piece of this puzzle. Bodyguard elevated the illusion to a psychological level. The Allies understood that in war, perception could be as deadly as reality. The Germans would fight where they believed the battle to be, and nowhere else. Divisions were redeployed, artillery moved, and reinforcements delayed, not because of combat, but because of the invisible hand of misinformation. Yet the brilliance of Bodyguard carried a heavy moral cost. Men and women died in operations that were designed to be misinterpreted. Bombing raids struck decoy positions, convoys were shelled, and soldiers perished at fake targets, all in service of a plan meant to safeguard a larger mission. The deception saved thousands on the beaches of Normandy, but it also demanded a toll from those who unwittingly became part of the illusion. Commanders issuing orders to shell phantom units were unaware that real lives were at stake, caught in the ethical paradox of war's cruel artistry. In London and Washington, officers monitored the unfolding web of lies with a mixture of awe and anxiety. Every day brought new reports. German patrols reporting fake troop concentrations, radar signals, tracking phantom fleets, and radio operators in Berlin misled by broadcasts from non-existent armies. Each success was exhilarating, but the tension was relentless. One misstep could unravel the entire plan, and the consequences would be catastrophic. The Germans, meanwhile, were moving pieces across the board based on false information. Hitler himself clung to the belief that the main assault would hit the Pas-de-Calais. The Allies anticipated this, intentionally leaking more false intelligence to reinforce his certainty. Every decision the German High Command made, every reinforcement held back, every defensive position strengthened, played directly into the hands of the planners in London and the soldiers on the ground. Those in the Ghost Army could see the effects of this deception in real time. Fields that should have been crawling with enemy patrols remained empty. Roads were eerily quiet, as divisions they knew should have been nearby were held miles away by the invisible hand of Bodyguard. The war, once a battle of brute force, had become a chess match played with shadows, illusions, and half-truths. The tension mounted with every passing day. Allied planners understood that the climax was approaching. Soon the real invasion would begin. Normandy would become the focal point of history, but only after the Germans had been thoroughly misled, lured into a false sense of security, and drawn away from the beaches where the real assault would occur. The psychological machinery of Bodyguard had to perform flawlessly, or thousands of lives would be lost. It was a delicate balance between brilliance and terror. Each deception had to appear real, yet remain invisible. Every message, every false convoy, every dummy camp had to withstand scrutiny. The planners became meticulous artists, crafting layers of reality that only existed to confuse, mislead, and control the enemy's perception. And through it all, the question lingered: could the human mind be fooled so completely? Could an entire nation, with its armies and intelligence networks, be guided by illusions, blind to the truth unfolding right under their noses? The Germans would soon find out, but by then it would be too late. In the quiet nights before D-Day, the Allies held their breath. From London to the fields of England, from secret offices to makeshift bunkers, the invisible war raged on. The web of lies tightened, ensnaring the enemy in a trap built entirely from deception. It was a silent, invisible campaign, yet its stakes were the highest imaginable. The human cost, the psychological tension, the artistry of illusion, all of it came together as the pieces of Operation Bodyguard fell into place. The Germans were marching blindly, following shadows, trusting false intelligence, and unknowingly stepping toward the very beaches where the world's most daring amphibious assault would soon be unleashed. And as dawn approached, the planners of this great deception knew one thing with absolute certainty: history would remember the courage of soldiers who charged the beaches, but it would almost certainly forget the invisible warriors, the ones who had fought a war with lies, art, and the human imagination. In those moments, as the Allies prepared for the final countdown, the tension was unbearable. Every miscommunication, every false report, every phantom army moved the Germans closer to disaster. The climax was imminent, and soon the silent invasion that had begun in shadows and whispers would erupt into the reality that would shock the world. The summer of 1944 was a season of shadows and whispers. and nowhere was it more treacherous than along the French coast. As the Allies prepared the largest amphibious assault in history, a parallel campaign, silent, invisible, and meticulously orchestrated, was unfolding under the codename Operation Fortitude. Its goal was deceptively simple: convince Hitler and his generals that the main invasion would strike the Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. Yet the execution required a level of cunning and imagination that would seem impossible even on paper. Across the southern coast of England, soldiers and planners worked tirelessly in secret camps. Not all of them carried rifles. Many were painters, sculptors, and engineers, tasked with creating a phantom army that could exist only in the minds of the enemy. Inflatable Sherman tanks dotted the countryside, their rubber skins puffed with air to mimic armor columns from the air. Dummy trucks, painted and camouflaged with meticulous care, lined makeshift roads, their presence confirmed by reconnaissance planes and enemy spies alike. Wooden landing craft, filled with mannequins and burlap sacks, waited at the shoreline, poised for a fake assault that would never occur. At the helm of this ghost army stood a man the Germans would fear even without seeing him, General George S. Patton. Though he commanded real troops in England, his name and reputation became the face of Fortitude's phantom divisions. The Allies used every tool available to make Patton's presence tangible: radio chatter, intercepted communications, and carefully planted intelligence leaks. The Germans hung on to every report, every snippet of news, their fear of Patton's brilliance fueling their decisions. Meanwhile, back in northern France, the German command grew increasingly paranoid. Radar screens still flickered with phantom signals. Reconnaissance planes reported columns of tanks and troops where none existed. Officers whispered rumors of an impending strike at Calais, reinforcing the illusions deliberately fed to them by double agents and the Ghost Army. Every diversion worked flawlessly. Troop movements meant to reinforce Normandy were delayed, entire divisions were held in reserve, and the German army began to fracture under the weight of its own uncertainty. The brilliance of Fortitude lay not only in deception, but in timing. Inflatable encampments were moved at night. Dummy artillery fired blank charges, and the sound of fake troop movements traveled through hidden speakers across the countryside. From above, German reconnaissance planes saw formations, heard the hum of activity, and reported back to headquarters. Each report, each confirmation, pulled the Germans deeper into the trap. Inside Berlin, Hitler and his generals were consumed with anticipation. Every message of a possible landing at Pas-de-Calais heightened their tension. Orders were issued to fortify the area, delaying the deployment of reinforcements that might have otherwise met the real invasion force on Normandy's beaches. General von Rundstedt and other officers debated fiercely, but their judgments were skewed by fear and misinformation. The Allies were waging a war in the minds of their enemy, and it was working brilliantly. Yet for the soldiers of the Ghost Army and the planners of Fortitude, the waiting was almost unbearable. Each night brought new uncertainty. Every patrol could expose a dummy tank. Every misstep could unravel months of planning. And still they pressed on, moving silently through fields and forests, their eyes fixed on shadows, their hearts racing with the knowledge that the fate of thousands depended on their ability to convince the enemy that an invasion was imminent where it would never come. The tension reached its peak in the days leading up to D-Day. German officers, poised on the cliffs of Pas-de-Calais, waited for a storm that would never arrive. They scanned the horizon for fleets and battalions that existed only in rubber and canvas. Their fear of Patton's phantom army paralyzed decision-making, and their miscalculations ensured that Normandy remained lightly defended. The theater of Fortitude was as vast as it was invisible. Inflatable vehicles were arranged with careful attention to perspective. Dummy camps were lit at night to simulate activity. Radio transmissions carried the sounds of planning and movement. Double agents, including the legendary Garbo, confirmed the presence of forces that existed nowhere. Every piece of the deception reinforced the others, creating an illusion so complete that the Germans could not distinguish reality from fabrication. By the time dawn broke over northern France, the Germans were completely ensnared. Entire divisions remained in Pas-de-Calais, their commanders convinced the Allies would strike there first. The real invasion force at Normandy had the advantage not just of surprise, but of an enemy blinded by its own fears and the meticulously constructed lies of Operation Fortitude. And yet, for the Allies, the victory was still unconfirmed. The silence stretched on like a taut wire over the Channel. One misstep, one German reconnaissance flight that exposed the illusion could unravel the plan. But as reconnaissance reports continued to confirm the presence of phantom divisions, a grim confidence settled among the planners. The Germans were fighting shadows, moving troops against phantoms, reacting to an army that existed only in deception, and they didn't even know it yet. In the tense hours before the invasion, the psychological pressure on both sides reached a fever pitch. The Allies' success depended not on guns or bombs, but on timing, precision, and the enemy's own paranoia. Every inflatable tank, every dummy landing craft, every false radio transmission had become a soldier in its own right. The battlefield had been transformed into a stage, and the actors were invisible. As night fell over the Channel, the pieces were in place. Fortitude had drawn the Germans away from Normandy. The stage was set for history to be rewritten. And while the world waited for the first real sounds of battle, thousands of invisible soldiers, artists, engineers and planners held their breath, knowing that their silent war would determine the fate of tens of thousands on the beaches that no one had yet fully realized they were about to storm. The Germans believed they were ready, that they were in control, and that their enemies were far from the Normandy coast. They were wrong. Every move they made, every decision, every division held back, was exactly what the Allies had intended. The Phantom Army had succeeded beyond imagination, setting the stage for the true invasion to strike and for history to witness the first major triumph of deception in modern warfare. The morning of June 6, 1944, dawned over Normandy with a pale, hesitant light, the kind that makes shadows stretch unnaturally long across the sand. The world held its breath. For the Allied forces, months of preparation, planning, and sacrifice had led to this moment. But there was more at play than anyone could see. An invisible army, a silent operation that had worked tirelessly in the shadows, ensuring that when the first boots hit the beaches, the Germans would be ready for the wrong battle. At 6:30 a.m., the roar of artillery shattered the calm. Thousands of shells rained down on fortified positions, softening the enemy defenses, while soldiers surged forward across the beaches under a storm of gunfire. Men waded through icy water, clutching rifles, struggling against the waves, while others climbed cliffs and scaling obstacles under deadly precision fire. The chaos was unimaginable. Fear, courage, and sheer will intermingled in every step, yet as fierce as the resistance was, the deception had already done its work. Entire German divisions that might have met the invaders head-on were immobilized, held in Pas-de-Calais, or scattered across the countryside by the relentless illusions of Operation Bodyguard and Fortitude. One captured officer later recalled, "We waited for an invasion that never came. And when the real one struck, we were caught unprepared." That unpreparedness, born of fear and false intelligence, meant the difference between thousands of additional lives lost and a more contained, albeit brutal, fight for the beaches. The Ghost Army, the architects of sound, shadow, and illusion, had played their part perfectly. Inflatable tanks, fake convoys, and dummy artillery had drawn enemy eyes and ears away from the real assault. Radio signals that mimicked the chatter of entire divisions had convinced Berlin that Patton's supposed army remained poised for the strike at Calais. And as the Allied troops stormed the beaches of Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juno, and Sword, the Germans were still debating, reallocating, and misreading the signals of an invasion that existed only in imagination. Amid the thunder of guns and the cries of the wounded, the human cost was staggering, but the unseen strategy saved countless lives. Soldiers who would have faced full-strength divisions found fewer enemies in front of them. Tanks that might have rolled over their formations never materialized. Every dummy vehicle, every phantom camp, every false report contributed invisibly to the success of the operation. Bravery on the beaches was amplified in part by deception in the shadows. Accounts from soldiers who survived those first hours paint a vivid picture. Private James Callahan remembered, "I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The beaches were chaos, but we pushed forward because somehow the enemy seemed spread too thin. They were everywhere and nowhere at the same time." That paradox, the enemy misjudging their position because of lies, illusions, and invisible armies, was precisely what the planners of the silent invasion had intended. As Allied forces pressed inland, clearing bunkers, seizing towns, and securing roads, the Germans struggled to respond. Reinforcements arrived too late or in insufficient numbers. Confusion reigned in the command centers, where officers relied on intelligence that had been carefully constructed to deceive them. Every mistaken calculation, every misread report, further tipped the scales toward the Allies. Amid the carnage, the story of the silent invasion quietly revealed itself. Men and women who had spent months moving inflatable tanks across fields, broadcasting fake signals, and designing phantom operations saw the fruits of their labor. Their war had been fought without a single shot, yet its impact was tangible. Lives spared, chaos minimized, and a strategic advantage created in the most unorthodox way imaginable. By midday, the Allies had established beachheads. The real invasion, brutal and chaotic as it was, had achieved the crucial breakthrough. Soldiers continued to land, tanks began to move inland, and the wheels of liberation rolled forward. And in the background of this monumental struggle, the invisible army, the one no history book would name for decades, remained hidden, its contribution unnoticed but decisive. Even as medals were awarded and battles recounted, the planners and artists behind the Ghost Army knew the truth. Their victory was quiet, uncelebrated, and yet it had changed the course of history. They had fought not with bullets, but with imagination, persuasion, and ingenuity. They had drawn the enemy's gaze, and in doing so they had reshaped the battlefield itself. In the chaos of that historic day, the emotional weight of the silent invasion was profound. Men waded through water, fired their weapons, and fell to enemy fire, all while invisible soldiers, artists and engineers far from the front line had already won part of the battle. Courage on the beaches of Normandy was inseparable from the invisible courage of those who had risked everything to create the illusion of armies, bunkers, and strength where none existed. As night fell on June 6th, the beaches were secured, but the memory of the day's horrors remained vivid. The bravery of the soldiers would be remembered, but the deception that had saved them and many lives would remain a secret for decades. Only the planners and participants knew that history had been shaped not just by bullets and bombs, but by shadows, sound, and art. In the end, D-Day was more than a landing. It was a masterpiece of strategy, combining courage and deception in ways the world had never seen. And as soldiers looked inland toward the future, unaware of how close disaster had come, the Ghost Army, the silent orchestrators, could finally allow themselves a rare sense of satisfaction. They had fought the unseen battle, and their victory, though invisible, had been absolute. The silent invasion had worked. History would remember the beaches of Normandy, but the invisible heroes, the ones who waged war without a single shot, had quietly changed the fate of nations. And as the Allies pressed forward into occupied Europe, the world was about to learn that sometimes the most powerful battles are fought not with armies, but with shadows, deception, and the courage to believe in imagination as a weapon. The morning after D-Day, the German High Command was a storm of confusion and rage. Berlin's war rooms were filled with maps, reports, and the anxious murmurs of officers trying to make sense of what had just occurred. Entire divisions that should have been defending Normandy were scattered across the countryside, waiting for an invasion that never came. Commanders argued, shouted, and blamed one another, each convinced that mistakes had been made somewhere, but no one knew exactly where. Hitler's fury was immediate and intense. He paced the corridors of his command bunkers, his mind unable to comprehend how the Allies had struck at Normandy instead of the heavily fortified Pas-de-Calais. The location he had been assured was the real target. In his anger, he questioned everyone, generals, officers, and intelligence chiefs alike. Suspicions spread like wildfire. Officers were accused of incompetence, cowardice, or even treachery. Some were demoted, others were executed on the spot, victims of a paranoia fueled by false intelligence and the fog of deception. Entire divisions were scapegoated for imaginary failures, their absence from the front lines blamed on human error rather than the invisible hand of Allied strategy. Within this chaos, trust dissolved. The German command, once rigid and disciplined, fractured under the weight of misinformation. Officers second-guessed orders, hesitated to act, and increasingly relied on what little accurate intelligence they could gather, never realizing that every report, every observation, every intercepted message had been manipulated to mislead them. The Allies had not just staged an invasion, they had shattered the enemy's ability to respond logically. Fear, doubt, and confusion became as powerful a weapon as any gun or tank. Meanwhile, on the Allied side, the atmosphere was dramatically different. In quiet command centers across England, officers and planners allowed themselves small smiles, subtle nods of satisfaction. The deception campaign, executed by men and women whose contributions would remain hidden for decades, had succeeded beyond imagination. Soldiers on the beaches owed part of their survival to phantom armies, inflatable tanks, and carefully orchestrated radio transmissions. The success of the operation was invisible to the world, but for those who had labored in secrecy, it was a moment of quiet triumph. Even as battles continued across the French countryside, the psychological effect of deception rippled through German ranks. Divisions that might have turned the tide were immobilized by fear and uncertainty. Orders were delayed, reinforcements misallocated, and opportunities lost. The Allies, by contrast, moved with a clarity of purpose and an understanding of their enemy's confusion. Every step forward was facilitated not just by brute force, but by a mastery of perception. The human cost of this invisible war was both subtle and profound. For the planners, there was relief that countless lives had been spared, but also a deep awareness of the moral complexity of their success. Men had been misled into deaths, believing they were responding to real threats, while others survived because of the illusions crafted in secret. Courage, ingenuity, and deception had collided to reshape the battlefield, proving that war could be won in ways far beyond conventional combat. In the aftermath, historians and officers would later reflect on the extraordinary ingenuity of the Allies. While the world celebrated the bravery of soldiers who stormed the beaches, the invisible strategists behind fortitude and bodyguard understood a truth few would ever acknowledge. Germany's shock was not caused solely by guns or planes, but by carefully constructed lies that had guided their every action. The most decisive weapon had been perception itself. By mid-June, as Allied forces consolidated their hold on Normandy, the German High Command remained trapped in a state of disbelief. Hitler's anger and mistrust had eroded cohesion, leaving commanders reluctant to make decisive moves. The fog of deception, woven through intelligence networks, phantom armies, and false radio chatter, had rendered one of the most disciplined military hierarchies in history virtually paralyzed. Every day that passed without decisive German counteraction reinforced the effectiveness of the silent invasion that had begun months earlier. The men of the Ghost Army, The double agents and planners could not walk the streets of victory or bask in public glory. Their triumph was quiet, invisible and uncelebrated. Yet as Allied troops advanced further into occupied France, the weight of their achievement became undeniable. They had reshaped the battlefield in ways that would never be fully recognized, proving that courage and ingenuity could rival the power of tanks and artillery. In Berlin, the psychological wounds left by the deception lingered. Officers continued to argue over phantom threats. Divisions were repositioned unnecessarily, and the Germans struggled to understand how an invasion could succeed in the face of what they had believed was overwhelming defensive preparation. The Allies, by contrast, had moved with a clear strategy, guided by both real troops and invisible ones who had fought without bullets. And as the weeks passed, it became clear that history had been decisively altered. Normandy had fallen, the Allies were advancing, and Germany's strategic paralysis had been orchestrated in shadows. The secret of the silent invasion remained classified, its heroes unsung, yet its impact was undeniable. A nation had been misled, a command structure shaken, and the course of the war shifted, all without a single shot fired by those who had engineered the deception. In the end, the aftermath of D-Day was not only a story of courage on the beaches, but also a story of brilliance in silence. While the world remembered the soldiers who fought visibly, the invisible army, the ghost army, the agents, and planners of bodyguard and fortitude had secured victory through ingenuity, deception, and an unwavering understanding of human perception. They had created chaos without engagement, confusion without confrontation, and in doing so, had reshaped history itself. Germany had been shocked, not by force, but by a lie so perfectly executed that it became reality in the minds of those who faced it. And while Hitler's rage echoed through the corridors of power, the silent heroes of the invasion had already begun the next phase of the war, their work complete, their sacrifices invisible, and their triumph enduring in the most profound, unspoken way imaginable. Decades passed, and the war that had reshaped the world slowly faded from living memory. Soldiers returned home, bearing the scars of battle, the weight of loss, and the unspoken knowledge of the horrors they had witnessed. Among them were a select few, men who had fought not with rifles or tanks, but with art, sound, and illusion. They had been the Ghost Army, America's silent warriors, and for decades the world never knew their story. These men lived ordinary lives. They returned to their families, found jobs, married, and tried to settle into a peace they had earned, but could not fully explain. In the quiet of their homes, they carried memories that no one could understand. Letters to parents were vague. Stories to children were carefully edited to omit the truth. "I couldn't tell anyone," one veteran later recalled. "Even my wife didn't know. How do you explain that your greatest battles were fought with rubber tanks and speakers?" Yet the impact of their work had been immense. The Phantom Invasion, Operation Bodyguard, and Fortitude had saved countless lives on the beaches of Normandy. Without the careful illusions they had created, dummy tanks, fake camps, inflated convoys, and carefully orchestrated radio signals, thousands more soldiers would have faced full-strength German defenses. They had turned deception into strategy, imagination into a weapon, and in doing so, they had rewritten the rules of warfare. For decades, the men of the Ghost Army waited in silence. Their bravery was quiet, their victories invisible. Unlike the infantry who were immortalized in photographs, films, and memorials, their battles were hidden in barns, forests, and empty fields across England and France. Each shadow they cast, every sound they projected, every fake division they orchestrated had been a life-saving maneuver. But it could not be celebrated. To speak of it would have been to reveal a secret too precious to share. It was not until 1996 that the veil was lifted. The operation was officially declassified, and the world finally learned the astonishing truth that art, deception, and ingenuity had played a decisive role in the success of D-Day. Exhibitions, documentaries, and books revealed the phantom tanks, the fake camps, and the clever manipulations of German intelligence. Audiences were stunned. How could an invasion of such magnitude have been shaped so completely by invisible, intangible means? Surviving members reflected on their experiences with a mixture of pride, humility, and quiet wonder. "We didn't fight with bullets," one said. "We fought with imagination." Another recalled the thrill of seeing German reports confirm every fake maneuver. Every time they reacted to what wasn't there, we knew we'd done our job. There was laughter too, tinged with sorrow, remembering nights spent hauling inflatable tanks across muddy fields, recording artillery sounds in empty barns, and crafting illusions under the ever-present risk of discovery. The story of the Ghost Army is more than just a tale of deception. It is a story of courage, creativity, and resilience. These men had risked their lives in ways invisible to the public eye. They had endured fear and uncertainty, knowing that a single mistake could unravel the operation, cost lives, or expose them to capture. And yet they persisted. Their battlefield was one of perception and illusion, and their victories, though unseen, were as vital as those won by soldiers on the front lines. In interviews and archival records, the veterans spoke of the moral weight of their work. They knew their deceptions had saved lives, yet they were painfully aware of the cost borne by those who fell in the execution of other operations. The complexity of war, its necessity, its cruelty, and its reliance on human ingenuity was something they had lived intimately. And for decades, they carried that knowledge alone, as silent guardians of a truth too extraordinary to share. As the public learned of their contributions, the emotional resonance was immediate. Audiences were moved not just by the cleverness of the operations, but by the humanity of those involved. These were ordinary men and women, artists, designers, and engineers, transformed by circumstance into warriors who fought battles without ever shedding blood directly. Their courage lay in creativity, their valor in strategy, and their heroism in their unwavering commitment to a mission the world would only come to understand decades later. Finally, the story of the Ghost Army allowed history to catch up with reality. D-Day, immortalized in films and textbooks for its bravery and violence, had another dimension, one fought in silence, where imagination replaced firepower and perception became a weapon. While the beaches were stormed and fortified positions taken, the invisible battle raged in the shadows, its warriors unseen, its tactics uncelebrated, but its results undeniable. The veterans themselves embraced the quiet recognition. They knew that their victory would never fully belong to them, yet they took solace in knowing that their unseen efforts had changed the course of history. "We didn't need medals," one reflection read. "We needed to know that our work mattered, and it did. And so, while history remembers the courage of those who charged the beaches of Normandy, it forgets the shadows, the illusions, and the Ghost Army who made that success possible. In barns, fields, and hidden corners across England and France, a silent army had fought without recognition, and in doing so had shaped the world forever." Their story, finally unveiled, reminds us that not all heroes wear uniforms, not all battles are fought with guns, and not all victories are visible. Some are forged in the quiet corners of imagination, creativity, and courage, the kind that survives only in memory, archives, and the hearts of those who once cast shadows across a world at war. While history remembers the beaches of Normandy, it forgets the ghosts who made them possible.